Dr. Elliot Kane leaned back in his chair, his eyes strained from hours of combing through data on Jupiter's atmosphere. It was late, the kind of late where the silence of the observatory hummed louder than the machines. He adjusted his glasses, sipped from a cold cup of coffee, and scanned the latest high-resolution images sent back from the orbital telescope. Jupiter filled his screen, its swirling bands of ochre, white and burnt orange mesmerizing as always. The great red spot dominated the lower quadrant, a storm 3 times the size of Earth, raging for centuries. But something was different. Kane leaned closer, narrowing his eyes. At first it seemed like a shadow, a darker patch in the storm's center. But as he zoomed in, the anomaly came into sharp focus. It wasn't just darker, it was precise, elliptical. It almost resembled an eye. His initial thought was a glitch in the imaging software. He pulled up the raw data feed to cross-check. The same dark, pupil-like void stared back at him. Kane felt a chill creep down his spine. He zoomed out and replayed the time-lapse data from the past week. The spot wasn't stationary. It had shifted subtly within the storm, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed unnatural. Could be an artifact, he muttered to himself, though his voice wavered. A play of shadows, maybe one of the moons. But it didn't explain the shape. Natural patterns, even in the chaos of a gas giant's atmosphere, rarely exhibited such symmetry. He uploaded the image to the observatory's analysis software, marking it as an anomaly. A routine peer review would settle it in the morning. Satisfied, he shut down the system and headed home. But the image lingered in his mind like an afterimage burned into his retina. That night, sleep eluded him. Kane found himself drawn back to his computer, pulling up the image again. The dark spot, sharp and focused, seemed to bore into him through the screen. He closed his eyes, trying to shake the unease. When he finally drifted off, his dreams were vivid and oppressive. He stood alone on a vast, desolate plain. The sky was pitch black, save for Jupiter looming impossibly large above him. The great red spot rotated slowly toward him, the dark pupil at its center expanding. It wasn't just a storm. It was watching him. As it swelled to fill the sky, a low, guttural hum vibrated through the ground, growing louder until his teeth ached. Kane awoke with a start, gasping for air. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to steady his racing heart. His forehead was slick with sweat, and the pressure behind his eyes lingered, a dull, throbbing ache. The dream felt too real, too heavy, as if it had pressed itself into his waking life. The next morning he arrived at the observatory early, hoping to put the strange dream behind him. Instead, he found himself scouring the archives, searching for any historical data on anomalies within Jupiter's red spot. Hours turned into days as he pored over decades of records. The anomaly was new. There was no record of anything like it before. When he presented his findings to his colleagues, the response was dismissive. Atmospheric distortion, one said. A freak interaction with Io's shadow, suggested another. Kane nodded along, but their explanations felt hollow. The data didn't align with any of their theories. That evening, as he sat alone in his apartment, he opened the image again. The dark pupil stared back at him, as though waiting. His rational mind clung to scientific explanations, but a growing primal part of him felt something else entirely, something watching. The hum from his dream returned, faint but insistent, reverberating in the back of his skull. And for the first time in his career, Kane was afraid of what he might uncover. Elliot Kane's world narrowed to a single purpose: understanding the truth behind the anomaly in Jupiter's great red spot. He stopped eating regular meals, skipped meetings, and avoided friends and colleagues. His apartment transformed into a chaotic research den, with printouts, charts, and ancient texts strewn across every surface. Images of the red spot, with its dark pupil-like void, filled his computer screens. Each new analysis deepened his unease. The shape wasn't static. Over weeks of observation, Kane noted subtle changes in its size and orientation, almost like blinking. He double-checked his data, reran algorithms, and even reached out to experts on planetary storms, framing his inquiry as hypothetical to avoid ridicule. The responses were polite but dismissive. Atmospheric turbulence, they said. Coincidence. But coincidence didn't explain the patterns. Late one night, after yet another sleepless stretch, Kane stumbled upon a reference in an obscure astrophysics journal to ancient Babylonian texts describing the eye of the heavens. It wasn't much, a footnote about celestial omens, but it stuck with him. He dug deeper, finding translations of cuneiform tablets that spoke of an all-seeing eye in the sky, a divine watcher that punished hubris. The text called it Niskira, the observer. The descriptions were eerily familiar: storms swirling around an eye of immense power, an ancient god that watched humanity's every move, silent yet judgmental. The uncanny parallels gave him pause, but he dismissed them as mythological coincidence. Still, he couldn't help feeling a connection. Kane's obsession deepened. He began to study other ancient cultures, Mesoamerican, Egyptian, even Polynesian, uncovering similar references to celestial eyes. Each culture described it differently, yet the essence was the same: a vast watching force that existed beyond comprehension. Some spoke of it as a protector, others as a harbinger of destruction. The more he learned, the more he noticed his own behavior changing. His dreams grew darker and more vivid. The barren plain and the looming eye of Jupiter became recurring motifs, but now there were additions. He would see himself standing under the shadow of the red spot, his reflection distorted and monstrous, his skin blistering and tearing as he looked upward. Sometimes he swore he heard whispers in the waking world, a low, guttural voice murmuring words he couldn't understand. Physically, Kane began to deteriorate. His skin grew pale, his frame gaunt. His colleagues commented on his appearance, but he brushed them off. When one of them finally confronted him, suggesting he take time off, Kane snapped. "You don't understand," he barked, startling even himself. "It's not just a storm. It's alive." The words hung in the air, absurd and unscientific, but Kane believed them. He had started to feel it, not just in his dreams, but in his waking hours. That persistent hum in his skull was no longer faint. It was a constant vibration, sometimes escalating to a piercing tone that made his vision blur. He avoided the observatory, unwilling to share his findings with anyone who might trivialize them. Instead, he devoted himself to studying the anomaly from his home. feeding the data stream directly into his personal servers. Each new image seemed to confirm his worst fears. The eye was moving more deliberately, its position shifting as though it were tracking something, tracking him. One evening, while poring over yet another set of images, Kane felt an overwhelming sense of vertigo. He gripped the edge of his desk as his vision swam, the room spinning around him. For a moment he thought he would faint, but instead his mind was flooded with an image. The great red spot, vast and pulsating, the eye growing impossibly large until it consumed him. When the vision ended, Kane stumbled to the bathroom, gasping for air. His reflection in the mirror stopped him cold. His eyes were bloodshot, the veins around them dark and pronounced. But worse, the whites of his eyes seemed tinged with a faint, reddish hue. He leaned closer, heart pounding, and for a moment swore the pupils of his eyes weren't round but elliptical. Panicked, he scrubbed his face with cold water and staggered back to his computer. His hands trembled as he typed, searching for any rational explanation for what was happening to him. But as he stared at the screen, the hum in his skull rose to an unbearable pitch. Then the whispering began again, clearer this time, words he couldn't understand but somehow felt compelled to obey. He clawed at his ears, desperate to silence it, but the noise wasn't external. It was inside him, emanating from somewhere deeper than sound. By the time the hum subsided, hours had passed. Kane sat slumped in his chair, his head pounding, his vision blurry. His computer screen displayed a new image of the red spot, freshly received from the telescope. He clicked to open it, his stomach tightening in dread. The eye was larger now, its shape more distinct. And for the first time, Kane noticed something else. Around the pupil, faint tendrils extended outward, like veins or nerves, stretching into the storm. It was growing. It was alive. And it was aware of him. Kane awoke to the sound of his computer pinging, his head pounding and his skin clammy. He didn't remember falling asleep. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the monitor, which displayed another new batch of images from Jupiter's orbit. The timestamp showed they'd been uploaded hours ago. He clicked through them, his breath catching in his throat. The eye was no longer confined to the storm's center. The tendrils he'd noticed earlier were spreading outward, lacing through the storm's bands like roots, growing in a tangled web. They pulsed faintly in the time lapse, as if feeding on the storm itself. But it wasn't the tendrils that made his chest tighten in fear. It was the unmistakable pattern emerging from their spread. A shape, a face. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. The tendrils formed the outline of a massive skull-like structure, its sockets deep and hollow, its mouth a jagged maw that seemed to vibrate with the storm's energy. Kane stared, unblinking as the image looped, each frame more defined than the last. Then came the sound. It started as a low rumble, barely audible over the hum of his computer, but it grew steadily louder, vibrating through the floor. Kane's teeth chattered as the sound deepened, resonating not just in his ears, but in his bones. He clutched his head, trying to block it out, but the sound wasn't external. It was inside him again, a primal roar that seemed to echo from the deepest recesses of his mind. And then it stopped. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive. Kane opened his eyes, panting, and froze. The computer screen was no longer displaying the images. Instead, it showed a single line of text in a language he didn't recognize. Jagged symbols etched across the screen, pulsating with a faint red glow. As he stared, the symbols shifted, rearranging themselves into something he could understand. "We see you." Kane's pulse raced. He scrambled away from the desk, his chair toppling over. He pressed himself against the wall, shaking his head. This wasn't possible. It was a hallucination, a stress-induced break. But the words burned into his vision, lingering even when he squeezed his eyes shut. He fumbled for his phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when he unlocked the screen, it too displayed the same message. "We see you." He dropped the phone as if it had scalded him, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. His apartment felt smaller, the walls pressing in around him. The hum returned, low and steady, building with each passing second. And then he blacked out. When he came to, he was lying on the floor, his head pounding and his mouth dry. The clock on the wall showed that hours had passed. His computer screen was dark, the room deathly silent. Kane staggered to his feet, wincing at the sharp pain radiating through his skull. He avoided the computer, afraid of what he might see, and instead stumbled into the bathroom to splash water on his face. The mirror shattered what little composure he had left. The red hue in his eyes had deepened, the veins around them now stark and black. His pupils weren't just elliptical anymore. They were elongated, stretching vertically like those of a predatory animal. He reached up to touch his face, and as his fingers brushed his cheek, he recoiled. His skin felt wrong, rubbery, as if it were loosening from the bone. He tore at his shirt, exposing his chest. His skin there was worse, mottled with faint red and orange patches, the texture thick and rough. He clawed at it in a panic, but the sensation was horrifying. It didn't feel like skin anymore. It felt like scales. A scream tore from his throat, raw and primal, but it was cut short by the sound of a familiar rumble. He turned toward the bathroom window, his breath hitching. Outside, the night sky was clear, Jupiter glowing brightly among the stars. The great red spot was visible even from Earth now, larger than ever before, its storm seemingly turned toward him, toward this planet. Kane backed away, his legs trembling. The truth hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just a storm. It wasn't even just a watcher. It was a living being, vast and ancient, stretching across dimensions. The eye wasn't simply observing. It was reaching out, testing, and now, through him, it was breaking through. He doubled over as a wave of nausea consumed him. His body convulsed, every nerve on fire. He clawed at his arms as the red patches spread, his nails raking through flesh that no longer bled, but cracked like the brittle surface of a dried-out riverbed. He collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, his vision swimming with bursts of red and orange. The hum in his head grew louder, transforming into a voice, deep, guttural, and impossibly ancient. The words were incomprehensible, but their meaning was clear. Submission. Kane screamed, the sound guttural and distorted as his body writhed. The voice didn't stop. It was commanding him, pushing him, reshaping him. As his consciousness faded, he realized the truth. The anomaly, the eye, the whispers, it had been reaching out to him for a reason. He wasn't its victim. He was becoming its vessel. Elliot Kane woke to an eerie stillness, his body sprawled on the cold tile of his bathroom floor. The sharp smell of copper filled his nostrils. His limbs felt alien, his chest heavy as though weighted by an invisible force. For a moment he hoped it had been a nightmare, a grotesque fever dream born from stress and obsession. But as he moved, the weight of his body betrayed him. His hands hit the floor with an unnatural thud. When he raised them to his face, he choked on a gasp. They were no longer human. His fingers had thickened, the tips tapering into sharp, translucent claws. The skin, or what was left of it, was now mottled with crimson and orange, textured like the swirling storms of Jupiter itself. He scrambled to his feet, gripping the sink for support. The mirror caught his reflection and he froze, a primal scream caught in his throat. His face was unrecognizable. The scales had overtaken his cheeks and neck, glowing faintly as if illuminated from within. His eyes, once human, were now unmistakably alien. They glowed with a predatory light, elliptical pupils dilating and contracting as they adjusted to the dim bathroom light. Kane staggered back, clutching his head as memories flooded his mind. Not his memories, but something deeper, older. Images of a vast, churning storm, a great pulsing eye that hung in the void of space. He could feel it. It was inside him now, its consciousness fused with his own. The whispers returned, clearer than ever. They spoke in a language that wasn't language, an unearthly resonance that bypassed words and went straight to understanding. It showed him everything, its origin, its purpose, and the truth of his transformation. The eye wasn't just watching. It was alive, a sentient organism of unimaginable size and age. It had drifted through space for millennia, existing beyond the boundaries of time and physics. Jupiter was no coincidence. It was its prison, a vortex designed to contain its endless hunger. But prisons, even celestial ones, do not last forever. And Kane, fragile, insignificant Kane, had been its key. It had watched him, tested him, and now it had chosen him. Through him it could reach beyond Jupiter, beyond the stars, beyond the constraints of space itself. He wasn't just a vessel, he was a bridge. Kane stumbled from the bathroom, the whispers growing louder with every step. His apartment felt suffocating, its walls too small to contain what he had become. He clawed at his chest, feeling the ridges of his new form, the faint pulse of something alive beneath his skin. The air around him grew heavy, vibrating with the same hum he'd heard for weeks, now a deafening roar. The sky outside was no longer dark. A faint crimson glow bathed the world, casting long, unnatural shadows across the cityscape. Kane's heart, or whatever now beat within his chest, thudded in sync with the pulsing light. The great red spot was larger than ever, its eye unmistakably turned toward Earth. The tendrils that had once been confined to Jupiter's storm now stretched across the heavens, weaving through the night like veins in a cosmic body. And then he heard it. Not the whispers this time, but a voice, deep and resonant, vibrating through the very fabric of his being. Awaken! The word reverberated through his skull, shattering any remaining fragments of his humanity. His body convulsed as the transformation accelerated. His spine arched unnaturally, his arms elongating, his legs buckling under the weight of his new form. His screams turned to guttural roars as his skin split and reformed, the glowing patterns of the red spot carving themselves into his flesh. The voice spoke again, louder this time, resonating in every corner of his mind. "You are the pathway." Kane staggered to the window, his alien eyes fixed on the glowing sky. He could feel it now, the full weight of the entity's presence. It was no longer confined to Jupiter. It was here, spreading through him, through the air, through the very fabric of the earth. The transformation was complete. Kane was no longer Elliot. He was a fragment of something far greater, an extension of the living eye. He could see through it now, through the storms of Jupiter, through the tendrils that stretched across the cosmos, and through the countless other eyes it had seeded across the universe. He was everywhere and nowhere, a part of an ancient intelligence that had watched civilizations rise and fall. He could feel its hunger, its infinite desire to grow, to consume, to see. Humanity wasn't its target. It was merely a stepping stone, a fleeting speck in its path. And yet, as the eye's will fully overtook him, a small, fractured part of his mind screamed into the void. The remnants of Elliot Kane's humanity fought desperately against the tide, clinging to the fading memories of who he once was. His own voice, weak and distant, whispered into the overwhelming roar, "Stop this, please." But the eye didn't stop. It couldn't. It was existence itself, an unstoppable force that transcended comprehension. Kane's voice was swallowed by the storm, and with it, the last trace of who he had been. Outside, the crimson glow intensified, bathing the earth in an unearthly light. The sky writhed with alien patterns as the tendrils of the living eye wove through the heavens. The hum became a roar, a sound so vast and all-encompassing that it seemed to split the sky itself. And then, as the storm reached its crescendo, the world fell silent. The eye had awakened, and humanity, once oblivious to the heavens above, was now under its gaze. Forever,